Hello, everyone. It is wonderful to have you here back on my channel, where I have a very special guest today, my old professor, Ron Dart, who is the author of, most recently, Myth and Meaning in Jordan Peterson, A Christian Perspective, and The High Tory Tradition, which I actually have right here with me. Ron, it is wonderful to have you here. Most people wouldn't know this, but you have been not just a professor, but a wonderful friend and mentor to me as well. So it's just a pleasure that you're doing this interview with me.
Oh, very kind of you to say that.
Yeah, but your most recent works have been around Jordan Peterson, but previously you have written a lot on the High Tory tradition and George Grant, as well as, you've got a plethora of books out there. But today, particularly, I wanted to speak to you about the word tradition, because it's something that a lot of young conservatives are trying to understand and revive. But I personally believe they have confused what tradition is with a superficial version. But before I give that explanation to you, could you explain to us what you view the word tradition as?
Yeah, so where you get people today who, for one reason or another, are reacting to what they see as the problems of liberalism or progressivism, the lack of meaningful grounding or center, the reaction to that is, well, let's go back to tradition. So then the question that always has to be asked, well, whose version of tradition? What are you talking about when you speak the word tradition? Because what happens often is people then, as I mentioned, they freeze thinkers, they freeze periods of time in terms of an alternate to liberalism or progressivism, and they say that's tradition, that is conservatism. But then you say, why did you pick those thinkers in that period of time? Now, Americans do that. You have more extreme people who will go on the right, they're returning to what they call tradition. And so it's usually a dualism in which there's a certain suspicion, a worry about liberalism, where it leads to in terms of an open-ended ethical position. And they want something solid, some grounding, some foundation, some roots that last, that allow them to withstand the ambiguous nature of liberalism. But then always the question you have to ask when someone says, I'm turning to tradition, well, what do you mean by tradition? Because as I said, it can mean many things. And so you have many people turning to the right, and they'll interpret tradition differently, even in the right itself. There's various types of, even we've just gone through the Trump era in the United States. Now, within the Republican Party, there are going to be some who see Trump as embodying tradition. They'll see the Atlantic, David Frum, as embodying tradition. And then you have people who are suspicious of those forms of Republican conservatism as well. And so it's always a question of, when you say tradition, then what do you mean by that? But it's often used as a sort of a code word for, well, I'm anti-liberal, okay, but I'm traditional. So what do you then mean by tradition? This is why intellectual history is very important. But if people have no memory, you can make them believe anything you want. Noam Chomsky once says, but memory is a form of intellectual self-defense. But with no memory, then people are very vulnerable to believe anything they're told.
There are a lot of people within conservatism and the right today, when they think of tradition, they look back to the 50s, the traditional stay-at-home wife, the husband who works the 9-to-5 job, the 2.5 kids and a white picket fence and church on Sunday, and they see that as the return to tradition. What do you think of that? Do you think that is an accurate view of tradition or not?
That's a small t tradition. And the turn to that is understandable, again, as a reaction to where you have serial relationships, where you have marriages that don't last, where there's no stability in relationships, where relationships are defined in any form that you want. And so a response to that to say is then, well, real tradition when we come to family is a man, a woman, The woman stays at home, the man goes out to work, one raises the children, they live in a suburb somewhere, they attend church every Sunday, whether it's Roman Catholic or Protestant or some form of Christianity. It's when Christianity was the dominant religion in the West. And so they say through secularism, religion is evaporating. As a result, they'll also argue the traditional notion, as they define it, of the family is coming apart. And so they define tradition in that way in terms of religion, family, gender roles. These are all clearly defined in opposition to a certain form of late modern, postmodern liberalism in which everything is liquid, everything is proteid. You can change and become what you want, like you change clothes.
Right. And what's the difference between that small T tradition and the big T tradition?
In what specific, because there's so many areas we can cover.
Right. So if looking back at that nuclear family model from the 50s is a small T tradition, what would be the big T tradition in contrast to that? What is the wider conversation around big T tradition?
So when you think big T tradition, first of all, you have to set that to some degree in the context of the Roman Catholic heritage, which tended to see the sacrament of marriage, but also the role of the monastic tradition. And marriage itself was not necessarily the alpha and omega of how communities lived together. There were monastic traditions, there were convents, and these were their own forms of community. With the coming to be of the Protestant tradition, it was a strong reaction to the Roman Catholic definition of a hierarchy of sort of what constitutes genuine, authentic faith journey. And with the Protestant Reformation, you get increasing the role of the family, the children, extended family. And so then there becomes this tension between what defines authentic family, a community of men living together, of women, or what became the bourgeois family. And so those are two different understandings as well when it comes to relationships. And certainly within the early forms of Christianity, you had one definition of men and women and children. The other, in fact, you had the authentic journey was done in terms of an ascetic tradition of not necessarily being married. And your real marriage for women was to God. This is why the Song of Songs, for example, became the great mystical work of poetry. It could be read literally, but it was also read mystically. And so the whole issue of what we know today is the family, where people are going back to traditional, it's a Protestant notion that's being undermined now by late modern notions of individuals can choose anything they want in terms of what they think makes them happy or fulfilled. And if one person that you're with ceases to fulfill your hopes, your dreams, then you just move on to another person. Like you go buying oranges and apples in a supermarket, the apple doesn't taste any good, so I move over to an orange. I don't like that horse anymore that I was riding, so I get on a different horse. So it's so when people call themselves traditional today, a certain reaction, it's usually a reaction to the imploding of any definitions of the good, the true, or the beautiful. And we just make up reality as we go along. It's what Yeats says, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy has been loosed upon the world. Not anarchy in terms of smashing windows, but people just making up reality as they see fit.
And do you think we are going to see more people kind of turning to traditional ideas of what life and structure and soul should look like in the face of that liquidizing of definitions and meanings? Or do you think that this liberalism is going to go on for quite a long time to come?
Well, isn't that the center of the culture wars right now? People on the right, either people in their late teens, early 20s, are seeing where a certain form of leftist progressivism goes. Some of them have experimented with it. They see it as a dead end and a cul-de-sac. So they're swinging over to traditional family values. the stability of a man and a woman being committed to one another with children over till death do we part. So I think at the heart of the culture wars underneath it right now is a form of progressivism in which there are no standards whatsoever. People just make them up. And a reaction to that, either people who see where it goes or have experienced what it is, and they realize, in fact, it's a dead end, and hence they turn to what they see as a rescue operation in terms of what real relationship should be, what commitment is all about, working through very difficult, problematic times, both within relationships, within families. But that's also how we're formed and we're shaped, and we learn to love in the deepest sense by working together through very difficult patches and road bumps in life. But in a culture that's raised with the notion that anything that interferes with my happiness, I just leave it away, rather than those things that interfere perhaps are the anvil of which we are shaped and we learn to love. And so suffering, in fact, is a means of growing deeper in love rather than running from it. We don't learn the lessons of suffering.
There are a lot of people who would take your words and my words, and many people who are frustrated with modern liberalism run amok, and they would say we are trying to stifle their freedom, we're trying to stifle their happiness. Why can't they have 20 genders? Why can't they be polyamorous and date whoever they want? Why can't they do these things? And to an extent, is it our job to tell them what they can and can't do? What are your thoughts on how we talk to those people and reach out to them with love and make it feel like not an attack, but rather tradition is a form of guidance that helps our lives give it structure for future happiness and fullness? What would your thoughts be on that? How do we communicate with these people who are so angry and fervent in their progressive radicalism?
I think underneath that question is the issue of the relationship of liberty and order and structure. Within a certain liberal tradition, which really emerges within the Protestant Reformation itself, is that order and structure is the problem that prevents me from being fulfilled, from happy, from living my life as I want. And so liberty, individual liberty, is the way forward. And so there is a model really emerging in the Reformation in which particular forms of Protestantism, Luther, Calvin, Anabaptist, they set in motion a way of thinking in which liberty is an unquestioned good and structure is the problem which hinders liberty. Now you secularize that notion, then you still got the notion that in fact liberty is the way forward, and any structure, any order interferes with my liberty, so it's the problem. It goes back almost to Paul's notion in the New Testament of grace versus law. It's the same. Law is the problem, grace is the answer. So it's a dualism. So often the way to approach that is to ask questions about what are the conditions that make for meaningful liberty. And that takes you into a very important level of questioning, because we do know again and again in our life journey that, for example, to use a few examples, is that if a person said, I'm going to use my liberty and I'm not going to eat, and I have the choice to do that, well, you have the choice to do it, but you die, or I'm going to use my liberty and I'm never going to sleep. Well, you're free to do that, but then you're not free to be alive for very long. There are conditions for you to be free to be alive. Or someone was to say, I'm going to use my liberty to drive on the left side of the road in Canada anyway, rather than the right. Well, you're free to do it. Then other people on the road are not free to drive safely. And so many other areas of life, we know that there is a form or a structure within which we are free to be alive, to feel free to drive on the roads safely. But there is this tendency within a certain type of liberalism to argue that that order and form and structure is the problem, and then you get post-structuralist liberty. And so often a discussion with people who just elevate liberty and individuality and see structure and order as the problem, you want to ask questions about all those things they do in life which presuppose structure and order from which they are free then to live. We don't, someone could say, I'm going to use my liberty to put my hand on a hot burner. Well, you're free to do that, but then you're not free to have a healthy hand. And so much in life is there are conditions that exist for us to be meaningfully healthy, whole, and truly free. But often when you get liberty pitted against order, then you get in this problem of anything that interferes with my individual liberty is the problem. And you want to have a discussion then and say, well, do you apply that in all other areas of life? Well, of course we don't. And so let's look at things like then at gender and look at identity and look at a whole range of, but it's an issue that really, it's an old historic problem, and it's playing itself out just in different ways. But it's just the next scene in an act of a larger historic, intellectual, cultural drama. That's all.
I do find it entertaining that a lot of young people think they're the first ones to have these ideas, think we're the first ones to have these debates. I came up with it first, and you're so right. It is history repeating itself in seemingly more ridiculous ways and manners. Now, on a much deeper and more important level, how do you think, I mean, you've even seen it in me when we've sat down for coffee and I can't quite let go of my phone, and we all just want the freedom to see, to consume, to have everything we could ever want in life with no restriction. And you've referred to it in the same sense that Hannah Arendt has, the vita activa. How do you think this, with our lack of structure, has impacted the modern soul?
Yeah, another good question. And again, tracking that historically is important. Martin Heidegger talks about our thrownness. We're thrown into a period of time. We're thrown into a body. We're thrown into a family. We're thrown into a historic context. Well, today people are thrown into a fast-moving culture and expectations on them and how they have to perform, what they have to do, their accomplishments. And this emerged in the 16th century called the vita activa, the busy, the hectic, the frantic life. And it is a reaction to the vita contemplativa, the notion of slowing down, being still, going to one's deeper center, what T.S. Eliot calls the still point in the moving world. And one of the ironies, again, is many people think they're free, but they're just victims of their own drivenness. And so this notion that somehow I'm choosing what I think that leads me to the greatest amount of happiness or purpose. Often people depends on the voices they're listening to inside, and they're usually voices of drivenness, of busyness, and then of course with all the forms of modern communication, they get addicted to constant attachments to these. And so the irony is that people think they're free, but they're highly addicted to a shallow part of their own personality, which is then reinforced by the commodity culture that we live in. Of if you consume this, if you have this, so essentially people have become cannibals. They're consumers. Consumers of various forms of identity, consumers of objects that they think are fulfill them, but then they're ravenously hungry once they sort of consume. It's similar to Homer's Odyssey, is that when he goes by Charybdis and Scylla, he's warned against that. And what the Scylla and Charybdis are, they're great empty monsters, and they consume and they eat, and then they're hungry again and they consume out of their emptiness. And people who don't have depth or a center, there's this ravenous hunger, and they're only temporarily satiated once they have what they want, and then they're hungry again. And their freedom is an attempt to fill up a deep emptiness because they haven't gotten deep enough to find a core. But that's called that's part of the vita activa that you mentioned, this drivenness, this freedom, but it comes out of a shallow understanding of the self rather than a deep understanding, which the contemplative tradition, but most people, again, fear solitude. They fear silence. They don't know what to do with stillness. And so then they just get busy because they're essentially addicted to a fairly shallow understanding of the self. And then freedom gets linked into that. And all it is a culturally conditioned addiction.
Hmm. It is a scary thing. I've noticed at the most active points of my life, I've had that where I've even been in the shower and I haven't liked how quiet it was because I'd have all these thoughts racing, all of these questions about myself, what I'm doing, my purpose, and, put on some music to distract yourself. And so many people are like that today, always keep themselves busy so they never have to think, which brings up one of my final questions here. And what I think is the most important is, how do we find ourselves again in this modern age? How do we find that connection with the vita contemplativa and the deeper aspects of being human in a world that encourages us in so many ways to distract ourselves from it?
I think one of the most important things, and I find this happening amongst people who are really searchers, real seekers, is one important area is to find women and men who you trust, shepherds of being, who care for a person's soul and want to nurture it at ever greater depths, where they take them to places, what in the Latin it's called quies or silento, those quiet places where they really know themselves at a deeper level, with women and men who are much further down the trail. And so one of the ways is to very much for people to look for those women and men who they trust, who are not going to betray them, who are not going to take advantage of them, but really care for the nurturing of their soul, their mind, their imagination, and help them to go to those deeper places so that then their lives are lived with much greater depth and wisdom and insight. And love, of course, is the highest of all of these. And so I think that's one way. The other is, obviously, this is why we read great works of literature. This is why we read, Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and Aquinas and Macrina and Hildegard, some of the great Protestant writers, some of the great Roman writers, because they're immersed in wisdom and insight. They've thought deeply about what makes for a meaningful life. That's always a secondary source to a primary source, which is a living person. And so the early church, they had the ammas, the spiritual mothers, the abbas, the spiritual fathers that younger people would come and study with and stay with. And they were trusted as guides. And those people in time themselves went on to become a spiritual ammas and abbas to others as they sort of worked through their own purgatories, their own infernos, and came out to their inner paradises of sorts. And so I think one would be obviously being immersed in a rich education in which one studies what Matthew Arnold calls the best that has been thought and said. And then secondary, living people who can be trusted on that journey, who themselves have lived from those great civilizational classics of wisdom and love, and they're inside of them, and then they pass it on like a torch to the next generation who will carry that light into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've even talked about this, well, the way George Grant puts it, find the university within the university. Find those people in all of your communities, which may seem shallow or connected to the world, but there are always people there that want to dive deeper. And it's been such a pleasure to, well, certainly when I was still in Canada, to find that group with your classes and Caleb, who's there with you. Before I wrap this interview up, though, where can people find you? Where can people explore your works?
Well, I suppose they could just bring up my my website at University of the Fraser Valley. I just had another book just came out. It's called The Gospel According to Hermes, Intimations of Christianity Within Greek Myth, Poetry, and Philosophy. And so I think if people listen to what George Grant talks about, people who have intimations of deprival, they've been given much, but been deprived of the most important things. Charles Taylor talks about the malaise some of the most sensitive people feel today. And if people listen to those sort of breadcrumbs within, their intimations of something not right, not repression, not denying, but in listening to them, to those they're gifts given to us, and if we follow them, they'll take us home to our true soul and homeland and hearth, where we really can rest with people we trust, of people of wisdom and of love. And it's these visions that have built up civilizations that have lasted, that have given us the great music, the cathedrals, the literature, the philosophy, the theology throughout history.
Always such wise words whenever we speak, whether through voice or email, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you on my channel here. I hope everyone else has enjoyed Ron's words, and I will certainly have him back on to speak. Ron, thank you again, and I will see you all next time.
Always a joy to be with you, Lauren.
Hey there, I'm not quite done with you all yet. I just wanted to tell you all a quick little story about Ron before you go. Ron was actually my very first professor at university. I remember being 18 years old and walking into that early morning poli-sci 100 class, terrified of my first day, just to be met with one of the kindest, most thoughtful faces on the campus, Ron Dart. No matter how crazy my other courses got, I knew there was always going to be that one grounded class that challenged and built up all its students with love and care. Ron really, truly goes above and beyond to help those around him, not just in the academic sense, but in the spiritual sense. He couldn't care less if you are going through a radical communist phase or you're a despised figure in the mainstream media like me. He really just wants to get to know you, and he wants to understand and support everyone's journey of soul, self-love, and thriving. I have flown into Canada after long adventures from work filming for Farmlands or Borderless, weary, heartbroken, and lost. And Ron was never more than an email away, ready to go for a long walk or a coffee to lift my spirits, lend me books, and guide me on my journey, and truly wanted to hear my story, not what others had told him about me. I feel so blessed to have this influence in my life, one of such genuine compassion and dedication to his work, and I really want you all to know his incredible academic and spiritual works as well, because he is so beyond deserving of our attention and respect. I've linked all of his information below, and I would highly encourage you all to check it out. Thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you next time.